Welcome to our study of Mipham Rinpoche's Sword of Wisdom, relying to some extent on the commentary by Kenshin Palden Sherab. I don't know if any of you came in here a bit early, and I apologize. I actually somehow I had an open tab in one of my browsers with the teaching that Tongsa Khensa Rinpoche is giving, and all of a sudden I heard this voice, and I go to this tab, and there's someone speaking, and I thought, it's starting. And I thought, this is odd, it's starting very early. But I actually thought it was live, and of course it just turns out to be a recording. It's the same YouTube channel, it's a recording that's running. And so, but anyway, I sort of failed to get that. So I went in here and said that today's program was canceled because Rinpoche was teaching. So, so that hopefully didn't, I hope you guys didn't see that or were deterred by it in any way. So so we are going ahead today. Now, as far as the subject matter goes, I would right away like to make a little bit of a disclaimer. Traditionally, Pramana epistemology is seen as being a rather dense subject, and as you know, fools rush in. And I read this the root text of Mipham Rinpoche's Sword of Wisdom, the Sherab, and I thought, oh yeah, we can do this. But I have to say, I'm coming up against some things that really require a little bit of sort of me thinking a little bit hard about things and so forth. So I'm going to cover some material today, but we might have to end early simply just because I'm going to have to do a bit more homework before I'm going to be actually able to present this from a place where I thoroughly understand it. Because of course I could just read through the text and so forth, but I wouldn't really feel good about presenting this without having a thorough understanding, at least an understanding that I'm satisfied with. So so let's just see. Let's just go ahead with today's material. And also, like last time, I ran into something that actually threw me a bit, and that's again an example of how this material is rather dense, and particularly the language can sort of trip you up a bit. So I'm just going to go back over that material before we proceed, and also in doing so, drawing on a really excellent presentation of some of the material from another source. So that's what's on today's program. We'll start with invoking the wisdom body of Jamgon Mipham Rinpoche. Through the blessing of awareness, emptiness, Manjushri Kumara, you open the expanse of wisdom and its 8 minds of confidence, thus mastering the vast treasuries of transmission and realization. Mipham Manjushri Gosha, I supplicate you. So, just to sort of sum up what we're doing, we are looking at something called valid cognition. And the reason why we do that is because we'd like to know what we're doing. And this is where in the Buddhist teaching, we're encouraged to think critically. Because if we just sort of say, I accept this because I trust in you, like Tongsa Khensa Rinpoche once made a point, we could very well choose a wrong guide. We could very well fall in love with a charismatic guide and just tag along with it. Rinpoche was giving the example of if you want to go to Paris and all of a sudden you see a signpost saying Marseille 5 kilometers. Well, if you're coming from the Dordogne where he was giving this example, and then you realize you're going in a really wrong direction. And that's why it's good to have some idea of the map. Now, often we would make a point saying the map is not the territory. And if we're studying the Buddha Dharma, right, we're not here to sort of become intellectuals and so forth. That's right. But we also shouldn't be naive and just sort of tag along, sort of being enamored with the beauty and the religious atmosphere, whatever it is that happens to sort of tick your boxes. There has to be the understanding that what we're dealing with here is getting to the bottom of suffering universally. And for that, and the Buddha's point is we suffer because we're just not properly understanding our reality. And that's where we have a 2,500-year successful science of effectively dealing with suffering, arriving at enlightenment. But we don't do this just as going into an alternative zone. We do this at investigating where does our confusion originate and how does our confusion manifest. And that's where looking at our reality and how we know reality is extremely important. It's also on the basis of that then that we begin to have confidence in the guide. We begin to see this guide really knows what he's talking about. This is the quintessential scientist. This is the quintessential wise person. This is someone we can rely on. Otherwise, just tagging along with all sorts of things just because it happens to be trendy or because it's on, TV, or it's in the books, or it's in the media, it's in the radio, and we're just sort of tagging along with the discourse, and everybody else is sort of just nodding and saying, yeah, yeah. Very often we have these discussions where we all sit around the table and go, yeah, 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 It's recently I saw a really interesting documentary. Elizabeth Mattis Namdal was recommending this as really an example of just how things sometimes get heated around particular topics. It was a docu, I forget the name of the guy, Matt something, but it's called What is a Woman? And essentially this, as a father, he watched how his children are being sort of naturally have particular styles. There's a boy and a girl. And yet there's the whole thing about genders. And so he goes out and says, okay, what is a woman? And he interviews people. And the typical answer would be, well, a woman is whoever identifies as a woman. And he says, okay, well, whoever identifies as a woman, what is a woman then? And that's where it's really interesting to see, because of course, what he is hearing is a circular logic. You are a woman because you identify as a woman without being able to explain what is a woman other than just saying you're identifying as a woman. So that's where he is looking for what in fact is what we can see then, a relative label. Yes, there's the idea of woman. There's the idea of, let's say, for example, I take my spoon and I say, this is a spade. And I can label it as that. But at the same time, and there's nothing wrong with me labeling my spoon as a shovel. But there is the implication that this is, for me then, it functions as a shovel because I can go out, I can dig in the dirt with it. And the same thing also with the label woman. It's a relative phenomenon, but if what he's doing is he's going out and looking for an absolute answer. It's very interesting. He ends up going to the Maasai, and the Maasai, they would just say, well, what is a man? It's somebody who looks after his family. What is a woman? It's somebody who gives birth and looks after the home. And for them, it's completely, the whole thing of sort of transgender and so forth is completely absent in their sort of worldview. It's a very interesting juxtaposition. Of course, what's interesting, that's not in the movie, is actually when the Maasai, this is just my own sort of thing, an aside, but when the Maasai they court, they actually dress up as women. When the Maasai men, the warriors, they court their future wives, they actually dress up or make up as women when they're courting their future wives. I know this because Tsongsa Khyentse Rinpoche once actually had a whole photo shoot where he was decked out as a Maasai warrior as a woman. It appeared in what was called the Shambhala Sun back in the day. Anyway, this is just to say that labels, they are relative, and that's where it's really important for us to understand that the way that we engage with the world is so much through filters of our subjective way of seeing things. Of course, we've talked about this many times, but I think it's valuable that we can see how this applies in our world. What's happening in that documentary is that when this guy says, oh yeah, well, what is a woman? And people say, well, it's whoever identifies as a woman. Then he questions that again, but what is a woman? People actually get angry because it's become a little bit of a holy cow, this whole thing, you know, well, that's no more discussion. I've fought to be free to identify as a woman. I don't want to discuss this. So that's where then there emerges this strong emotionality and this sort of tension. And that's where we can see it's something that this sort of lack of understanding the relativity of our labels, it causes wars, it causes deep emotional splits. I remember when I grew up and I was arguing with my dad every night at the dinner table. This was because we didn't understand properly relativity. We didn't understand how the other person sees things differently. My dad had his ideas of how things were in the absolute sense, and I had my sort of, I would probably maybe even sort of argue for relativity or whatever, but I probably had my own absolutes. And that's where we see this creates so much trouble within ourselves, within societies, within the phenomenal world. So what we're talking about here is not some abstract theme. Now again, when it comes to this study, we are looking at the world. And that's where we also understand, well, there's the relative world, and that's where we can understand relative truth then. That operates, like we saw, in terms of an understanding of how everything in this world has its particular way of functioning in terms of cause, in terms of phenomena depending on what they are and so forth, like medicines. So we might use a particular medicine, we approve of it because it has the particular ingredients that implies that it's a good medicine, and it also does the job. So we operate about these notions of dependency and causation and so forth. But of course, we label it simply according to how it functions. We would just say the nature of it is medicine. But that's where when we look at this nature again, we say medicine, we label it, yes, because that's its nature. And yet in the absolute, this is just a label. It is empty of any reality behind it. And the way that we get to this is on the basis of us investigating. And that's where we're presently looking at the way that we investigate, and we basically use what is the theme of this present topic, namely valid cognition, pramana. And that's where then when it comes to pramana, we primarily operate with what we can directly experience, what we in the Western scientific tradition refer to as empiricism, verifiability. We apply the senses. And that's where we last time have looked at the 4 ways that we directly encounter phenomena in terms of we can have objects that are the objects of the five senses. We can have mental objects. We can also have then what we call yogic direct perception, which is what ordinary persons don't see, but what we begin to see when the mind is less confused. And then finally, we have the aware direct perception. So, and that again is the mind that knows what the mind has. So for example, we can think of, let's say, a tree, and that comes up in the mind, but there's also the quality of knowing that. And that's where we talk about the mind as being self-aware. And that again is direct perception. It's not something that comes up on the basis of concepts or anything. So that's what we looked at last time. We're going to go on to the second kind of valid cognition, which is then what we call inference. And inference is again where we can understand things on the basis of essentially seeing signs. For example, we say we know there is a fire when we see smoke. And that's where, again, we can generally understand things on the basis of perhaps things we can't see, but we can infer them. So we'll be looking at that. But this is really just to put all of this in a context, because this is so valuable in terms of us understanding the world and understanding it validly, and also seeing beyond the appearances of the phenomena. So presently then, we will just briefly, I want to go back over a section last time where I was a little bit unsure. And it was really there where it says, it's basically a comment on the verse 26. And that's where it says, whatever the other direct perceptions experience is ascertained as being direct perception through self-awareness. Without this self-awareness, there would be no way to establish this. And so I got a little bit thrown by it, and I'm also wondering if this is the best way this could have been translated. I had a look at the Tibetan, and but anyway, what it's really saying is, yes, we have direct perception. We see something, and we can also, on the basis of seeing something, we can also infer, for example, similar objects would be in the same way. Let's see that we look at a piece of lapis and we see that it's blue. Then if somebody talks about, I have some lapis at home, we can't see that piece of lapis that they have, but we can infer that that it would also be blue. Now, in this way, both the direct perception of a piece of lapis or the inference, and so they generate image of something blue. But in either case, it's at the end of the day, this is entirely known by this self-awareness. It's an object of a mind that simply just knows. And so that's where the commentary runs. If there were no self-awareness, there would be no way to establish that an experience of direct perception is direct perception. For example, we're told to visualize, right? We take refuge in the Buddha, we visualize the Buddha in front of us. Well, it's not that we are having that the Buddha is in front of us. We're generating it on the basis of our imagination. We're generating it as a mental image, but we also know that we get distracted, right? And then we go, oh, I was distracted. Well, who knows that we were distracted? That is this self-awareness. It's the mind that knows itself. And that's where then here Khenpo Palden Sherab says, without any kind of self-awareness, we wouldn't know what it is that we're experiencing. So that's where he says it can be done only because the mind knows itself. For instance, if someone says it is clearly established that the visual consciousness sees the color blue, and the implication here is that's not valid. He says this must be established by either direct perception or inference. So first, for it to be established by direct perception, another direct perception would have to establish it at the same time or at a different time, but neither option is feasible. And what we mean here is something other than the self-awareness. When we're here talking about just the direct sensory perception or mental perception, and that obviously, to establish it, there would have to be another one behind that establishes that. And that's not going to happen. That's just not the nature of the particular perceptions that just have a simple object like a visual perception or a mental perception. They are just, you could say, the qualities of knowing an object. So that's where this essentially is on the basis of the reasoning here. And we can, of course, argue with that, but the implication is that it's simply not a valid way to understand an object. It cannot really establish the actuality of an object. There has to be something that knows. It's not just that we would say the dominant factor in seeing something is that the eye is functioning. So there's something behind that. And then the second argument here, since there can be no establishment of the visual consciousness through inference, because without a direct perception as its basis, there is no inference. So that's also, for example, if I talk about a lapis lazuli that I haven't seen, I think of the object blue, that would be because there has been some direct perception of a piece of lapis, and that's where the the inference itself doesn't do the job. There has to be an awareness behind. This is really just, the point here is to essentially establish what we generally think probably of as just our basic consciousness. And in the following it says, therefore, since pots and other objects are made of matter, it's impossible for them, they're inanimate, to be clear in knowing about objects. Knowledge about the nature of objects must depend on a mind that is clear, knowing, and other than the objects themselves. Consciousness is not like matter because it knows its own nature without needing to depend on any other conditions. Okay? So now we've come really and touched on a really key theme, which is the difference between mind and matter. So at this point, I thought it would just be very appropriate to have a look at what do we mean with mind. Recently, some friends of mine, really kindly, they sent me this book. It's called Science and Philosophy in the Indian Buddhist Classics. And this is actually brilliant. It's based on some writing from some knowledgeable Tibetans, and then with commentary by a really splendid person, really the sort of the great authority on this topic that we're discussing, namely a guy called John Donne. He's an academic, I think, at University of Wisconsin, but he then writes in here some what we call contextual essays that essentially introduces the material and makes it understandable for us. But it's also the articles themselves are very clear, the classical articles, which are originally written in Tibetan. But this is an initiative by the Dalai Lama and also by Thupten Jimba, who's the Dalai Lama's translator. And so this is volume 2. There's one that's about the outer phenomenal world, how that's understood in a Buddhist context. And then this one here is about how mind is understood within Buddhist science or within Buddhist phenomenology, Buddhist pramana, valid cognition. So that's where I extracted a little section from this book, which I thought would be helpful to look at. And it's called The Nature of Mind. So for those of you who are familiar with the Great Perfection teaching, this is not an introduction to the nature of mind, but it's more an analysis of what really mind consists of. So this is quite helpful for us, certainly for anyone who is, you'd say, applies what we can call introspection and looks at our own mind. And this is, of course, what we do in the Buddhist teaching, not as an exercise in being introverted or in sort of not wanting to deal with reality or anything. It's actually looking at what constructs our reality and what is really the most primary phenomenon that we know and through which we also know the phenomenal world, all our perceptions. So the nature of mind is a really a key topic for what we're doing. And that's where we very often come across this expression. Then in Tibetan we would say that the mind is salrik, and it means clear and knowing. Salwa means clear, and rik means simply just that quality of knowing, that simple knowing. So this section here then talks about mind. So it's very good for us who sort of come with a sort of, this is intended for people who are sort of new to the whole science of the mind. And John Donne then writes, the first part of this volume presents an account of mind drawn from Indian Buddhist sources. And this immediately raises some difficulties for readers accustomed to notions of mind in Western philosophy, psychology, and cognitive science. One key issue that the term mind in Western context suggests a single entity that endures over time and has various capacities, dispositions, or features. So that's where we have this in our cultural discourse and also in our scientific discourse around mind, the idea that there is just one mind. This is me. This is what I have. This is what I am, and so forth. In contrast, the Buddhist sources cited by our authors maintain that mind is episodic, such that a mind, Sanskrit chitta, is a continuum, santana, of mental moments, each moment causally emerging from the previous moment and acting as a cause for the subsequent moment. So that we can also identify. We can say, if I sit and I ponder gratitude, then that will create a particular mood in my mind. If I sit and think about something with resentment or anger, that will generate the next moment in the mind, and so forth. So we can see that our mind is continually influenced moment by moment, episode by episode. This is so key for us, particularly when we're explaining the notion of what our thinking is in meditation, where we can see that our mind will jump from here to there. But if we sustain particular ways of thinking, we're just creating particular experiences moment by moment, episode by episode. And this is then what we begin to string together, and we call it a narrative, and we give it a particular label, and it becomes much more solid. And we're failing to see that it's us who are creating these thoughts on the basis of present fixation on a particular thought, and this then becomes the basis for the next thought. And as such, we end up operating with the idea that this is me, this is my experience, this is my life, this has happened, or this will happen, or this is how I am. And that's where we fail to see actually how it's really just moment by moment. Otherwise, we would always be stuck in the same thought, and we're not. It's like we can be deeply brooding about something, and then somebody comes along and talks with us, tells us some jokes, distracts us, and all of a sudden we feel completely different on the basis of these images, these episodes, these input that came onto the mind. So that's where we should really understand mind as this, like it says here, a continuum of mental moments, each moment causally emerging from the previous moment and acting as the cause for the subsequent moment. Each mind is just a unique moment of consciousness, jhana, or awareness, samriddhi. So that's where this mind that we have right now is a unique moment of consciousness and awareness. This is happening right now. This we can verify. The analysis of the nature of mind is thus actually an analysis of what in many Western contexts would be a moment of mind or a mind event. In a way that can be additionally confusing, Buddhist authors will often speak of plural minds that pertain to the same person at different points in time or different contexts, such as, and this of course also is what we've seen in Abhidharma in general, we have a moment of looking at a white wall, and then we have a moment of hearing a bird, and then we taste, and then we think. And all of these are episodes of mind. So that's where we can talk about various minds, various singular moments of consciousness. So again, it says here, Buddhist authors will often speak of plural minds that pertain to the same person at a different point of time or in different contexts, such as the mind in a moment of visual consciousness or the mind in a moment of one-pointed concentration. Both of these minds could be in the same continuum, such that in referring to someone named Jane, one could speak of Jane's many minds. That's here. There's also a locution that seems odd in Western contexts. But yes, I have many moments of consciousness. I have many minds. I have the consciousness that generated on the context of seeing, hearing, etc. So that's all we're talking about. But that's how the mind also needs to be understood, really, as having that quality of consciousness that is connected with perception. In our translation, so this is John Donne saying, we have tried to avoid using the plural minds as much as possible. But it is important to note that even in the singular, the term mind refers to a single mind event. That is a discrete moment in a mental continuum. So that is in fact what we think of as our mind, these moments after moments. So we can choose how we want to direct them, or rather, we very often find out that we can't. And we're very often on the basis of our fixation, we're very much married to this fixation on particular themes and so forth. And that's where we fail really to understand the nature of mind. What we're trying to do here is trying to gain an understanding, a valid understanding of how, if we observe mind, in fact, are just, like it says here, discrete moments of mental continuum. Now he says, turning now to the nature of mind, our authors focus on the most widely cited account, namely that mind is clear, Tibetan salwa, and aware, jikpa. Here the term clear renders two distinct Sanskrit terms that evoke the phenomenal character of mind and also one of its essential properties. In relation to the Sanskrit term prakasha, the Tibetan translation is most accurately rendered as luminous, in the sense that the mind illuminates or presents contents, such as a lamp illuminates whatever is nearby. Unlike a physical lamp, however, the mind does not depend on proximity to illuminate whatever is present in a moment of consciousness. The concept of the Eiffel Tower, for example, can be presented in consciousness without any need for one to be in Paris. A second key feature is that even in exceptional cases, when a moment of consciousness has no cognitive content, a mind or moment of consciousness still includes the phenomenal character of presenting or illuminating, even though there is no content to be illuminated. So the first is that we have actual objects, and the second is more just that there is a condition of being aware. There might not be an object, but the mind still has this quality of awareness. But in the case of this experience of, let's say, the Eiffel Tower, there is then the vivid experience of an object. So that's where, again, this mind has this quality of being luminous or clear. So that's where we mean with clear. It can create images, it can bring forth imagery in the mind. The mind is also clear, so that's the first meaning. So that's the idea of prakasha. So then it says the mind is also clear in that it is transparent, prabhashvara. Here the term clear points to a fundamental property of mind. Water, for example, is by nature clear in that even when it is murky, the impurities that obscure it can be removed, and its natural clarity or transparency will return. Likewise, the mind is clear in that no particular object, such as the Eiffel Tower, or an affective state, such as anger, is essential to a moment of consciousness. It's not something that's enduring, solid in any way. The point is, especially, John Donne says, the point is especially crucial for Buddhist approaches to personal transformation and behavior change, since it means that the dysfunctional habits that produce suffering and dissatisfaction can be transformed precisely because these various conditions are not essential to mind itself. This means in particular that ignorance, the fundamental cognitive distortion that underlies suffering, is not an essential property of the mind, and is therefore possible to remove that distortion without putting an end to consciousness itself. So this is where we have Tongsa Rinpoche, who says when we take refuge, the most important thing is really to understand that our mind is curable, it's changeable. And that, of course, is also intrinsic to the entire notion of dependent arising, emptiness, and so forth. And it's also intrinsic to the third noble truth when we talk about cessation. Yes, there's suffering, but suffering comes about due to particular causes we can work with, and we can bring about cessation. This condition of suffering is not basic to the mind. And so that's where this understanding that ignorance, this fundamental cognitive distortion, it's possible to remove that. It's possible to bring about the end of that. It's not basic to our mind. So that doesn't, and also an important point to be made here, that distortion that we identify as essential to our being, that is really just a confused product that has no intrinsic reality. So removing that doesn't mean that we put an end to consciousness itself. So here then we understand in terms of the clarity, we say mind is clear. When we say that mind is clear, then we sometimes think, oh, but right now my mind is not clear. It's a bit murky or whatever. Well, it is actually, because it couldn't change if it didn't have that quality. It's again a bit like the crystal, that we can place a crystal on a white cloth, a blue cloth, a red cloth, or whatever, and the crystal will take on the particular shade. So that's where mind is clear, in that it allows for any phenomenon to arise. And also it's clear in that it can generate particular images. So that's the about clarity. And John Donne then writes, while the mind is clear, perhaps luminously clear, to capture two senses encompassed by that term, it is also aware, mrikpa, sambit. In general, this means that a mind or moment of consciousness has an epistemic character. That is, the mind does not simply illuminate, it also does so in an informative way. And that's where we could say it is essentially intelligent. There's an awareness taking place. That's what we mean with Rigpa. More specifically, at the level of analysis deployed by our authors in the descriptions here, and in general discussing mind in a Buddhist context, a mind or moment of consciousness is about its object, and it presents the object in a way that is relevant to action that engages that object. So that's again, this is where we have a seer, someone that is aware about something. Our authors point out that mind, by virtue of being aware, is distinct from matter, which lacks that character. So that's where, before when we were reading in the text, where then the Khenpo says, pots and other objects are made of matter. It's possible for them to be clear in knowing about objects. Yeah. So consciousness is not like matter, because it knows its own nature without needing to depend on other conditions. So that's where we distinguish between mind and matter. So that then he writes, yet 2 points here are crucial. First, while the mind is distinct from matter, it nevertheless depends on a material basis for it to function, meaning that there is an object that generates a particular image, or there is some sense of something there that creates the experience of consciousness. In other words, the mind is necessarily embodied, and the constraints posed by a particular embodiment, such as the capacity of one's sensory organs, must be taken into account when examining cognitive processes and other aspects of mind. So we can see how this embodiment plays out in that our perceptions are intimately linked up with sensory organs. Second, while the mind is intrinsically aware by virtue of presenting objects as relevant to embodied action, it is not necessarily the case that a moment of awareness, that is, any given mind event, provides reliable information about its object. So that's again where we definitely could have perceptions, but we might also have misperceptions, in the sense that we might not really be able to rely on what we're seeing. A bit like the stick that's put into water and it looks like the stick bends. It is for that reason, in part, that Buddhist theories are so concerned to distinguish the many variety of awareness. So that's where, because we are so dependent on awareness and what happens with the mind, that we continually are operating with the various ways in which the mind then can be valid or invalid. This is where we presently particularly are looking at the understanding of valid cognition, that we can arrive at a place in which we understand the objects. So that's where that just because we perceive something, think something, and so forth, we need to take into account that we could be misperceiving it. And that is, of course, the entire theme that we're looking at here in terms of the two truths, and particularly in terms of the two truths, how relative and absolute truth they function, and how relative truth is understood in terms of then essentially what we call the direct perceptions and inference. So so basic to anything really that we're perceiving, we then have the general perceptions in terms of the objects that are perceived in terms of sensory, being perceived through sensory objects, mind that generates images. And then, of course, what is, you could say, uncommon is the yogic direct perception. But what is important when we talk about yogic by direct perception is that we're not talking about something that's generated by mind, but actually of a clearer seeing. It's vipassana. It's seeing in a wider way. Just like also within our world, we can see how sometimes afflicted individuals fail to really see what's there. And once we have someone who is less afflicted, somebody who's clearer, we can rely more on their judgment. So that's where yogic direct perception is simply just a quality of seeing without necessarily there being any particular conceptual activity. But basic to all of this is the underlying awareness. And that's where then this fundamental awareness, it is the ground of, you can say the unentangled quality of just simple knowing. Self-awareness. And again, this is not about awareness of the self. This is awareness that doesn't have that is not, you could say, dependent on something other. And as such, we could also, I prefer actually to translate it as own awareness. And some would say natural awareness. But in that it is just that which rests in itself, we very often just say self-awareness. And it says here, self-awareness is a very appropriate term to use because the mind experiences itself merely by arising, in that there's a functioning mind there. By nature, it is clear and knowing, what we've just discussed, and free from the threefold reification of object, agent, and action. It is similar to a butter lamp which illuminates itself. So this we actually covered last time. Anyway, it's probably good to go over it again. That self-awareness rests in itself, and it doesn't necessarily have to take any object. It is aware of the objects, but in itself, it doesn't really fall into the category of something that is generated on the basis of object, agent, and action. And that's where the discourse on valid cognition says conceptualization is also posited as self-awareness. Objects are not self-awareness because self-awareness is what realizes objects. So we can, from the basis of the self-awareness, sometimes refer to that when we're thinking about conceptualization. But we would also say that the self-awareness, it goes beyond just the conceptualization. It's more basic, but it is that which can generate conceptualization thoughts. Objects are not self-awareness because self-awareness is what realizes objects. It's the awareness that knows objects. And then we have the Majjhimika Alamkara, the adornment of the middle way, where it says, being singular and partless by nature. It is illogical for it to have a threefold nature. Therefore, self-awareness is not a substantial thing with an agent and an object. Since it is the very nature of consciousness, it is appropriate for it to know itself. So this comes down to the very nature then of, you could say, the ground consciousness, or the nature of mind. So now, just to sort of conclude this direct perception, I know we went through this last time, so I'll just sort of go over it again. Inference is rooted in direct perception, and direct perceptions are ascertained by self-awareness. When the experience of an unmistaken mind is reached, nothing further is needed to establish that. Therefore, on the basis of direct perceptions that are non-conceptual and unmistaken, misunderstandings are eliminated about manifest phenomena. So this is essentially how we can understand our reality validly on the basis of direct perception, inference, and then self-awareness. Khenpo Palden Sherpa says, inference is rooted in direct perception because it arises based on the power of a sign experienced by direct perception. Since direct perception is ascertained by self-awareness, it is necessary to classify self-awareness as direct perception. All experiences of the mind that are unmistaken because of not being caused by delusion come down to self-awareness. So this also implies really that self-awareness possesses this quality of prajna, in that it's not entangled in delusory projections. In and of itself, in that self-awareness is free from duality, it doesn't get entangled up in the ordinary confusion that comes from duality. So it really resides as what we could call the nature of mind. But here, we're not talking about this in a Dzogchen understanding or anything like that, but more simply in the understanding of a valid knower. So once self-awareness has been reached, there is no need to search further for something to prove that, because self-awareness is the experience of, once self-awareness has been reached, there is no need to search further for something to prove that, because self-awareness is the experience of an unmistaken mind. So that is essentially the premise of our knowledge. For example, it is like finding your elephant. Once you have found it, you need not keep searching for its footprints. So we went over this last time. This is so big that it's not as if we need to look anywhere else. So inferential valid cognition comes down to direct perception, which is what knows objects of consciousness. In the end, direct perception comes down to self-awareness, which clearly experiences itself. If one accepts the valid cognition of ordinary perception, one must also accept self-awareness. It wouldn't work for self-awareness not to be there. So the stance of denial is refuted. The way that self-awareness is established as being authentic is taught extensively in the scriptures of the two lords of reasoning, Dignaga and Dharmakirti. This little bit refers to some of the discussions we have around in Madhyamika context. And so let me just continue this here. Because based on the four kinds of direct perception, all of which are unmistaken and are non-conceptual in terms of not mixing with names, it is the valid proof of direct perception that eliminates experiential misunderstandings about manifest phenomena, such as perceiving a vase as something other than a vase. So what we're talking about here, really just the way that we know the world. We're getting rather specific in terms of identifying whether it's with the senses, whether it's with the mind, but what we are bringing home is really that we can know this is ultimately known clearly by this awareness that's behind the perceptions. So here the Khenpo sums up. To sum up, inferential valid cognition comes down to valid direct perception. And valid direct perception comes down to valid self-aware direct perception, which clearly experiences the mind itself as an object, as its object. Therefore, all the classifications in the world of what is true and what is false would have no logical basis without self-awareness on the relative level. We should understand that the refutation of self-awareness in the Madhyamika treatises uses reasoning on the absolute level only to refute self-awareness's true existence. Madhyamika philosophy does not refute self-awareness on the relative level. And this is also a point that Sangha Rinpoche so often would make, because of course in the Madhyamika teachings there's so much emphasis on refuting this self-awareness as posited by the Yogacarya, and that's where Sangha Rinpoche would often say, and this of course is ubiquitous across all the teachings, that the problem with basically the Madhyamika agrees with everything the Yogacarya say, except that this self-awareness should have some absolute reality. And that's where we can then say, okay, ontologically, we can establish its emptiness, but at the same time, in terms of the phenomenology or experience of this awareness, it still is something that ascertains and functions in terms of not being deluded. And so that's why we sometimes have this divide between those that really insist that even this nature this Buddha nature is something that is empty even of itself, or some would say, no, that is for real. It's the delusion that it's empty of what is other. So that's where we have this sort of bickering around the Shentong and the Rangtong. So this is more just in terms of for those who attended the teachings on the Madhyamika. But essentially here, we're just really identifying how we know things on the basis of what we see, hear through the senses, what we can think of in the mind, and in terms of then the knower, the consciousness that's behind. So this, of course, is something that very often in our ordinary life, we're so superficial that we're not really aware of what stirs within ourselves. So of course, this is here where we're talking about going beyond just sort of the ordinary distraction and very much being sensitive to what is really happening with us on a sort of a deeper, immediate level. So it's important we don't think of this as something abstract, but rather as something that's very much talking about what's happening to us every moment. So this is not really philosophy. It is very much about science, but it's a science that doesn't exclude consciousness and rather makes consciousness as a primary object of this science. So just like you would say in the hard sciences, people would say, well, we're sort of dealing with what's real, and over in the humanities, they're all about abstractions. So in some way, that's true. Here we are dealing with what is real, what we can observe, know in terms of our immediate experience. So nothing abstract happening here, really. Let's see then. Funny. I call a spoon my coffee shovel often. Also, at the dinner table discussions with your father, basically you were arguing relativity as an absolute. That's true. Yeah, I would say, my sort of liberal views that take into account tolerance, for example. We should be tolerant. Well, there's other people who don't believe in tolerance, right? so it's true. That's where you can perhaps argue for the functionality and the validity of tolerance. But yes, that becomes also a dogma in itself, But that's again where when we're talking about the nature of emptiness, that also could become a dogma, and that's where really at the end of the day, the beautiful thing about the Buddhist teaching is the non-aggression. It's sort of there. Similar also, the Buddha could have charged into the world and saying, I've found the truth. But the Buddha just says, I've found the truth. I'm not sure anybody will understand. Better I just stay quiet. So I used to have a similar discussion regularly with a friend that duality itself implies non-duality, because in a world of opposites, the opposite of opposites is no opposite. Sounds very true. How does karmic predisposition work in with that moment to moment causality? Well, that's exactly what karma is that we have laid down what we call vasanas, or patterning, in the old ground. And that is essentially what generates the particular moment to moment experiences in consciousness. And there are moments where we don't have external objects, and where then the mind will just generate, on the basis of these vasanas, will generate its own imagery. And that's what happens when we dream, for example. So essentially, we could say the way that we interact with the world continually is on the basis of our karmic predisposition, that we have put down particular patterns, and that's what generates all the imagery that we have. So while we could say there is in fact just a field of particles, neuroscience would say these images that we have are generated on the basis of in the brain and so forth, in terms of physical components. Then in the Buddhist teaching, we would say these are the karmic predispositions that essentially are coloring and providing qualia, providing solidity and experience with regards to the fields of perception. So that operates continually from moment to moment, where these dispositions work from one microsecond to the next, continually changing and operating within our field of experience. Oh, this is very sweet. Just an aside, someone here comments, the person who introduced me to Buddhism said, don't get comfortable. It won't last if you're going to study Buddhism. That's a good one. But you know, that actually goes fine with Karl Popper's notion of falsifiability, you know, that we only have real science when we know that it can be falsified, when we know that it's something that is not just an absolute, that's some sort of metaphysical truth that nobody can touch, that we actually have it down there and we're continually challenging our assumptions about it. That's right. Yeah. She was so right, and nowhere more than through doing this particular study. That's right. I tell you, even in the Buddhist colleges, pramana and studies of what we have here referred to as the discourse of valid cognition is sort of like a dreaded topic. But it's also the same thing, we could say hard sciences, those that go in and study, particle physics or whatever it might be. There might be a dreaded topic, but we rely on them. We rely on them as being those that actually understand our reality, and that filters down through the discourse and essentially informs our worldview. So it's that place that we need to go to, the actual hard, intelligent analysis that essentially, constitutes what we could call the epistemic, or the valid premise for our understanding of the world. So that's also why we would say that's where, once we get this down, our faith becomes irreversible because there's a very clear understanding. It's like, we can say, the image I'm always giving of a couple in bed upstairs, and then she says to him, honey, I think there's a burglar downstairs. And he says, no, it's just a cat, and then he would like to go to sleep on the basis of saying, oh, it's just a cat, he can't be bothered to get out of bed and look. And so that's where, as long as they're both lying in bed there, but there's a bit of uncertainty happening. The moment that he were to go down, or she were to go down, switch on the light and see, in fact, it is the cat. Then there's certainty. And the same with science universally. We have to have certainty. Once we have certainty, we understand something, then we can operate, we can function with it. We can't build a bridge thinking, well, I think it might just work. There has to be certainty, like I started off saying with this study, somebody gets an 8, the government forks out $800 million for a particular bridge somewhere, well, they better be reassured that this works. And so similarly also, we engage in the path to enlightenment. We can't just say, well, I like the guru, he's very nice, and I like compassion, and I like mindfulness, and so on. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But if we're talking about enlightenment, we're taking refuge in the Buddha as someone who has seen reality, who's no longer confused. Then we're saying this person understands reality. When we aspire to enlightenment, it's on the premise of there's actually a proper understanding of that. And this, of course, also is where, in the Western context, you know, we defined enlightenment as once science had divorced itself from all the sort of metaphysical impositions of the church. So essentially, valid science, enlightenment, is based on what we're studying here, valid cognition. So on that note. Okay. So by the way, this article this contextual essay, is that what it's called? Yeah. Of John Donne's, I've uploaded, so it's sitting up in the resource folder. Okay. So next time we'll be looking more at then inference. Let's see here. The inference based on evidence. So again, this is where we infer, then on one hand, we have a valid understanding on the basis of what we can perceive directly, but also we use inference a lot, that we understand things. For example, our whole knowledge around, let's say, medicine or biology or whatever it might be, is all the time about observing things and beginning to extract knowledge about how these things function. So this will be something very relevant for us in terms of understanding how we know things. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. Thank you very much. And just an announcement, as some of you probably know, then yesterday we celebrated Sagadao Duchen. And on account of that, then Tsongsa Khyentse Rinpoche gave some teachings. And these will continue today. According to Australian Eastern Standard Time, it'll start at 2:30, run in the afternoon, and then also run in the evening. So just to let you know that's happening. All the information you have in the emails that have gone out, but also you can find it on the website. So thank you very much.